If you want to learn more about the mRNA vaccine so that you can make a more informed decision for yourself and your family, then keep watching. Hi everybody, I am Nikki and this is my very first science-themed YouTube video, and I am so excited, and I am also so very nervous. And so I think in order to sort of quell some of this nervousness, I wanted to talk about a couple different things before we get started. One, this channel is going to be for everyday science for the everyday person, or everyday science for everyday people. And so basically this is science for anybody who went into a discipline other than science and they're just curious about science and want to know more about it. And then, or even, people who did study science but didn't study the specific things that I'm going to talk about in this channel. So that's one, science, everyday science for everyday people. Two, I want to say, I studied science in college and grad school, but that doesn't mean I know everything there is to know about science. And I don't want to sit here on the other side of your iPhone or your iPad or your TV and pretend like I do. However, I would be more than happy to not only talk about the scientific topics that I'm really familiar with, but also things that I might not be so familiar with that, I can easily do research and interpret for you and then present to you in a way that you can understand. So that is, I think, the main, thing I wanted to get across before we actually dove into the meat of this video, which is understanding mRNA vaccines. So by the end of this video, you will know what a virus is, how vaccines work, what mRNA is, and how mRNA works in the context of a vaccine. So let's cover a few terms before we get started, and that is the name of the disease and the name of the virus. So COVID-19 is the name of the disease caused by the virus SARS-CoV-2. So COVID-19 stands for coronavirus disease 19 because the outbreak, as you well remember, started in 2019. And then this disease is caused by SARS-CoV-2, the virus. So SARS-CoV-2 stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, Coronavirus 2. And SARS-CoV-1 was responsible for the outbreak that happened in Asia back in 2003. These vaccines are working against SARS-CoV-2, the virus, to mitigate the chances of getting sick with COVID-19. Okay, viruses, what are they? So they are actually really simple. They are just DNA or RNA, so some kind of genetic material that has a protective protein coat around it. And viruses lack all of the cellular machinery needed to make copies of itself. So in order for this virus to survive and make copies of itself, it needs to invade a host cell. So the way in which viruses, this particular virus, SARS-CoV-2, enters cells is it uses its protein coat, a particular protein called the spike protein. And so the spike protein attaches to our cells via, another protein on our cellular surface, and then it gains entry, and once it does that, it hijacks all of the cellular machinery required to make itself. So it's actually pretty ingenious, and that's probably one of the reasons why I studied in college, because it just seemed so cool. It was very minimal, and it used the host cell's machinery to make copies of itself. So in the case of the SARS-CoV-2, this spike protein is the key that the virus uses to get into our cells. And so this is the main target of these vaccines, because a lot of the antibodies made against SARS-CoV-2 are specifically made against this spike protein. And it was also observed that people who were infected with SARS-CoV-2 made a lot of T cells against this spike protein. And I'll talk a little bit more about T cells in a little bit. So once these viral particles get into our cells, they will make many copies of themselves until our cells burst and die. All right, so what are vaccines? I think we all have kind of this basic working knowledge of what vaccines do. So basically, a vaccine is sort of this biological concoction that, when introduced into our body, it stimulates our immune system so that when we are faced with a pathogen later on, our body has a fighting chance against it. So things like, the polio vaccine or the measles vaccine, or even the smallpox vaccine. Really interesting story about the smallpox vaccine, by the way. So it was invented in 1876 by this man called Edward Jenner. And so what he did was he would take the scabs and like blisters of people infected with cowpox, which was related to smallpox but much less lethal in humans, and he would take it and rub those scabs and that pus against the abraded skin of healthy people. And those healthy people would not go on to develop smallpox. And this was called skin-to-skin inoculation. And so I say that he invented it because probably 800 to 1,000 years earlier, the Chinese were already doing this, but they weren't calling it a vaccine. In fact, the word vaccine is from the Latin word vaccinus, which is derived from the word vacca, which means cow. Isn't that so cool? Okay, anyway, back to vaccines. So these concoctions contain either weakened virus, or they will contain like viral particles, or they will contain genetic material like the mRNA vaccine. All right, so how do these vaccines stimulate our immune system? So basically, they present the body with a protein that our body recognizes as foreign. So when foreign proteins are outside of our cells, antibodies can bind them and neutralize them, and they can also signal to B cells to make more copies of antibodies specifically against that foreign protein. Once cells are infected, killer T cells come and deal with these infected cells. And so it takes a while for all of this to happen, for us to make all of these antibodies and to make more T cells and to, signal all of these B cells, probably about a week or so. And then we can also, give ourselves a booster shot so that we have an even, better advantage over these foreign pathogens. So in terms of immunity, you now have all of these antibodies circulating in your blood. You've also got these B cells that are making these antibodies. And then you also have these T cells that you're making more and more copies of, so that when you finally do get, if you finally do get infected with whatever pathogen, your body already has all of the artillery it needs to fight the infection. So sometimes when we get vaccinations, we experience like low-grade fevers, or there's like soreness in the area, or you may feel fatigued. Those are all just signs that the vaccine is working and that your immune system is reacting properly. So what is mRNA? So in order to understand RNA, we need to look inside of our cells. So RNA is chemically similar to DNA, and DNA is located inside of our nucleus. And our nucleus is just this membrane-bound sac that contains our DNA. So this is a cross-section of our cells, and within like complex organisms like ourselves or like yeast, we have our genetic material inside what is called a nucleus. Now, the main compartment of the cell out here is called the cytoplasm. And our cytoplasm has all these different membrane-bound sacs that do lots of different things for us. They give us energy, they make other proteins, lots of different things. All right, guys, so this part is super, super cool. And if you understand this, you will understand a lot about molecular genetics. So what happens is within our cells, inside of our nucleus, our DNA gets transcribed into RNA. And then that RNA comes out into the cytoplasm of the cell, and then it gets translated into protein. So our DNA codes for protein and is responsible for all of this, which I think is really cool. And it does so via mRNA. So we have tons and tons of mRNA species already in our body. All right, guys, so a good analogy for this process is if your DNA were like handwritten notes that you'd taken during like a meeting or a Zoom call, like in English. And then you would take those handwritten notes and you would type them up onto your computer. So now they're typed up. And those typed up notes are like your messenger RNA, your mRNA. So then you take your typewritten notes and then you translate it from English to Spanish. And that Spanish translation represents your proteins. All right, cool. So now you know how mRNA works in our bodies, but how does it work in the context of a vaccine? So RNA tends to be very, very unstable chemically. I mean, I remember working with it in lab, and we used to have to like wipe down our lab bench and all of the tools and everything so that, you know, we wouldn't contaminate the RNA with anything that could degrade RNA, which is like everything. So the mRNA vaccine is mRNA inside these little tiny fat droplets called lipid nanoparticles. And basically this lipid nanoparticle protects the mRNA when it is delivered into our body and into our cells. So once it's inside of our body, these lipid nanoparticles will bind to the outside of our cells and then allow that mRNA to go into our cells. So once this mRNA is inside of our cells, it gets processed just like all of the other mRNA inside of our cells. So that mRNA gets translated into protein. And so for this vaccine, the protein that gets translated is spike protein. So remember the spike protein that was the key for this virus to get inside of our cells? Well, this vaccine is going to make just this spike protein and nothing else. So none of the other viral genetic material, none of the other viral proteins will be made, just this spike protein. So once our cells make this spike protein and these proteins come out of the cell, these proteins are going to be recognized by our antibodies, and these antibodies are going to tell our B cells to make more antibodies, and then we're also going to have a T cell reaction where you're going to make more copies of the T cell that recognizes this protein. So we don't have an active virus replicating in us, we just have this little tiny viral particle that our immune system is now making ammunition against. So when these antibodies bind to the spike protein, they can neutralize this virus by blocking that key that gets it into our cells. So if and when later on you were exposed to SARS-CoV-2, these antibodies floating around in your blood can neutralize the virus by binding to spike protein and preventing it from getting into our cells and then making more copies of itself. Meanwhile, your B cells have made many more antibodies, and then you've got these T cells running around, killing anything that might have actually, infected a cell. So basically, this mRNA vaccine codes for spike protein. And so when it expresses this spike protein in our bodies, we make weapons against SARS-CoV-2 so that if and when we are exposed to SARS-CoV-2, we already have everything that we need to fight it effectively so that the virus doesn't overtake our immune system. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate your time, and I will see you in my next video. Bye. For this channel, and so no, SARS-CoV-2. Just tasteful. Exactly what a